Tonight, it's like we never voted no. Now Victoria's version of The Voice demands non-Aborigines pay them reparations. Plus, meet a Human Rights Commission worker and pro-Palestinian activist.
Mate, you are not wrong. We actually do hate Australia.
Also tonight, we were promised a cut in immigration, so why has it just rocketed to a whole new record? And why Lisa Wilkinson and the ABC are dead wrong about the verdict in the Britney Higgins case.
Today, the federal court has found that I published a true story.
It's an extraordinary victory for TENS, the project.
Oh no, they've been exposed. But first, I'm giving Defence Minister Richard Marles credit today for one important thing, telling the truth about the terrible danger Australia's in. The problem is, I'm now thinking, yes, and you're doing what? Marles was scarily honest in talking today about the new National Defence Strategy he released, like we won't have a defence force fit for the next war until the next decade. But China is a threat right now, he said. The danger has even got worse over the last 12 months, his words.
China has employed coercive tactics in pursuit of its strategic objectives, including forceful handling of territorial disputes and unsafe intercepts of vessels and aircraft operating in international waters and airspace in accordance with international law. Australia no longer has the luxury of a 10-year window of strategic warning time for conflict.
Marles says, we're unlikely to be invaded, but we could just be strangled. China can just block our shipping lanes.
The invasion of Australia is an unlikely prospect in any scenario, precisely because so much damage can be done to our country by an adversary without ever having to step foot on Australian soil.
Now, here's a simple example of how stupid we've been. And I don't just mean we haven't spent enough money on the right weapon for years now. You take our petrol supplies. Once Australia had 8 refineries here. Now our petrol could be cut off like that.
Today there are just 2 refineries left. Around 80% of what they refine is imported crude oil. And today around 85% of our liquid fuel needs are supplied by imported refined product, most of it from just 3 countries, Korea, Singapore and Malaysia. We are literally dependent on this sea line of communication. The rules of the road at sea are everything for us. When the rules-based order is under pressure, Australia is under pressure.
And then there's the possibility of North Korea firing its nuclear weapons, a war between China and the US, war in the Middle East right now, or this huge land war in Europe, Ukraine. The world has got massively more dangerous. So when Marles had laid it all out, naming also the China threat, naming our weaknesses, viewers would have been desperate to know, well, what are you going to do about it so we can defend ourselves like Marles said we must?
There is now one job at hand: transforming our future capability such that Australia can resist coercion and maintain our way of life in a much less certain region and world.
Now, all this is spot on as far as I can tell. I mean, we do need weapons that can reach China's ships, say, or, as Marles said, our adversary way out at sea. We need many more missiles, long-range ones, the nuclear submarines we've ordered, drones and more soldiers too. We'll probably have to hire from New Zealand and the Pacific. All that we needed, said Richard Marles. And again, you'll say, oh, well, yes, good. And spend what exactly? How much more? And then we got to it. An extra $50 billion, he said, spread over the next 10 years, mostly on more ships and missiles. But of that $50 billion, just 5 will be spent in the next 4 years, which works out to, just over $1 billion a year, $1.5 billion. But then Pinky promised massive more spending in the 6 years after. Well, I should also add that Marles outlined billions in savings with that money directed to this new weaponry. Essentially, so we'll have a bigger navy that can hit an enemy much further away. But let me put it bluntly. And remember, yes, most of the fault is with the past Liberal governments. It's this. We're told the world hasn't been this dangerous in years, but we won't have our nuclear subs for a decade. We won't have the big surface ships we need for another decade. We won't be in fighting shape for almost a decade, but we're spending less than $1.5 billion a year extra on our defence. Now, asked about this mismatch between the danger and the response, Marles was defensive.
This is the biggest commitment in terms of increasing the defence budget over the forward estimates in decades.
All true, but we probably haven't been in this much danger for decades either. So to me, it doesn't really add up. And you know how it strikes me? Richard Marles is a smart man and spoke very well today. He can see the danger, he can see what we need. But the people really running the Albanese government won't give him the money to buy it, and fast. But am I too sceptical? Let's ask an expert. Joining me is Dr. Malcolm Davis, who's worked in the Department of Defence and is now a senior analyst with the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Malcolm Davis, thank you so much for your time. Is Richard Marles right about the danger we're in? I thought he seemed pretty honest about that danger coming from China, especially. Usually it's let's not mention who the threat is.
Look, I think as with the Defence Strategic Review last year, this year with the National Defence Strategy, Defence Minister Marles is correct to point out the danger that China places against us. I think that the NDS, the National Defence Strategy, if you read it, it essentially clearly lays out that threat from a rising China that is acting in a way that's inimical to Australia's defence and security interests, not just in terms of directly against Australia, but within the region. So the strategic outlook in the National Defence Strategy that was released today is correct.
Now, that's all very well, but then where's the solution?
Well, the solution is what worries me, in the sense that when you look at what Marles was saying in a speech at the National Press Club today, he was emphasising investment in long-term capabilities that would start to appear by the mid-2030s and go from there. He seemed to be de-emphasising the sorts of capabilities that we would need to have if a major crisis broke out is as early as the second half of this decade. And I think everyone understands what this is. It's a Taiwan Straits crisis where China seeks to impose unification on Taiwan against the will of the Taiwanese people. As the United States decides to come and assist Taiwan and then calls on Australia to step in and support the United States. Marles seemed to be downplaying this scenario. He seemed to be de-emphasising the requirement for being ready for this sort of short-term threat in favour of a strategy of hope that is based around an expectation or a hope that nothing bad will happen in this decade and we can actively prepare for crises that could occur off in the distant future.
That hardly seems a strategy to me. Look, I buy part of the excuse that a lot of this can be sheeted home to the Liberals not doing the right thing. But that said, the crisis is now, the situation suddenly got much worse now. It's upon us now. What do we actually need to do? I mean, maybe you just can't go to the shop and buy a destroyer right then and there, but what can we realistically do right now?
Well, firstly, I think this lack of decision and this paralysis that has plagued defence planning goes back further than the Liberals. It goes back to 2009 when the Rudd government released its defence white paper and then the Treasurer promptly pulled the finance rug out from that defence white paper and defunded defence. So it goes back a lot further than the Liberal government. But I think you're right, we can't essentially acquire major weapon systems and platforms overnight. That's just not practical. So what we need to do is start investing in high technology capabilities, investing in autonomous systems, drones that are lethal and armed. We need to be investing in space capabilities where you have a vibrant commercial space sector in this country that needs to be fully supported by the government. It's not. There's real concerns in the space sector about this government's indifference to space. And I think it needs to look at real investment through agreements such as AUKUS towards advanced long-range strike capabilities. Now, Defence Minister Marles did obviously talk about that today in his speech, but when you look at the capabilities we're getting, a lot of them won't start turning up until the late 2020s or early 2030s, and a lot of them lack the range to strike at Chinese capabilities in areas such as the South China Sea. They are still short-ranged in comparison to what we need.
And even the good weapons, it's great that they arrive, but it's bad that they arrive perhaps after the war. So that's not much good to us. Malcolm Davis, thank you so much indeed for your time. Really appreciate it. But, all right, the Albanese government apparently is not sinking its money into something like space research to help defend us, but it has plenty of money to now splash on companies it's picked as winners, except by sheer coincidence, they're in the green energy business, which Labor's quite hyping. There was the Prime Minister today saying he was backing a Queensland company that's helping to make batteries to store green power. And he was taking a punt on it with our money as loans.
This is what is going to power Queensland. This is where the investment will be.
Now, Albanese said last week there's going to be much more of this kind of picking green winners under his new program to be called Future Made in Australia. Joining me are Cameron Milner, former Chief of Staff to Labor leader Bill Shorten, now Director of GXO Strategies, and Michael Costa, former New South Wales Labor Treasurer. Cameron, picking winners, green winners, is this a smart use of our money? I mean, when we could be investing in our military instead, since we're in such danger?
Well, I think we can do both, but government has a poor record of picking winners. That said, government does have a role. I mean, we wouldn't have the North West Shelf with the oil and gas. We wouldn't have the met coal industry in Queensland if government hadn't actually got out there and helped investment. So government does have a role, but picking winners, the government hasn't got a great record, unfortunately.
Michael, what would you do? Pick winners or just clear the field for the entrepreneurs by lowering taxes, cutting red tape, cutting green tape, cutting all the punishing restrictions on business?
Andrew, the more I see of this government's economic policies, the more disturbed I'm getting. I mean, this stuff smacks of, Rex Connor and Whitlam. We rather than put the Whitlam government on a pedestal, we need to go to the more progressive, economically progressive Hawke government and look at its policies. It removed tariffs, it removes all these subsidies and allowed for a vibrant economic growth in a number of sectors. What this will lead to, and I guarantee it, is economic failure. These companies will fail. If they require support from government beyond some initial research support, they are doomed to failure. We cannot compete. And the reason I say that is, on the other hand, he's got, Bowen increasing the cost of inputs, and he's got Tony Burke destroying all the labour market reforms of the Hawke government. This is going to end up in welfare capitalism, the worst form of crony capitalism. It's going to be an economic disaster.
No wonder even their own hand-picked Productivity Commission boss has warned against exactly this, yet they're going ahead. I mean, it's great because Albanese now can play Santa in one state after another, just handing over our money. Cameron, to the shocking and warning to viewers, this is distressing. The shocking stabbing on Monday of the Assyrian Christian Bishop Mari Emmanuel in Sydney's West, allegedly by a 16-year-old Arabic speaker, was reportedly recorded saying the bishop had defended his faith. Now, that stabbing, plus the riot against police afterwards by supporters of the bishop, not all of his church, I should add, had this reaction from the Prime Minister.
It is vital, in my view, that we continue to stress what unites us.
Cameron, what do you make of that reaction when I must say that Labor and the left have been doing the opposite with their race politics, their three flags, their multiculturalism and their attacks on our history in Australia Day? But what do you make of this?
Well, the New South Wales Police have declared this a terrorist act, and it was. It was a horrendous act on a Christian bishop by a person who was obviously clearly radicalised and clearly, allegedly, an Islamic individual who obviously has become quite extreme in terms of what he's done. But what worries me about the Prime Minister's reaction is I can't work out whether he's too weak whether the Prime Minister's too weak or too woke to stand up to Islamic extremism in Australia, because we clearly have it. We have hate preachers in Western Sydney and we do nothing about it. No one's charged, no one's investigated properly, and that's our problem here.
Yeah, I should repeat, because as all this is going to be for the courts, this boy is alleged to have done it, courts to decide ultimately. But you're right, Michael, the point that Cameron makes, and he makes it also brilliantly in his column in the Australian today, is there an excuse for the government? Like, it's clearly thinking, whether it's an excuse not to offend the Muslim voters, all right, let's put that theory aside, because I think that's probably likely. It's thinking, why amp up the temperature when everything's so fraught? Is that an excuse for not confronting the hate preachers on social media?
Look, I think it is the responsibility of government, and at both levels, having operated in the police portfolio, to try and tone down the heat in this. I think, the incident itself was horrific. The behaviour afterwards was equally as horrific. I mean, it's one thing to sort of say the Islamic community, has elements within it that are radicalised and could lead to these types of events, alleged events. However, the behaviour of those that confronted the events was appalling. That doesn't reflect Australian values, and I don't care if they're Christian or Buddhist or any other religion they choose to be. That is not the way to respond to police. It was a disgrace. So I think they do need to tone it down. However, you're right, Andrew. We need to get back to the things that unite us. We need to get back to the values that we share in common, and part of that is the right to respect other religions and to practice your own religion without a fear of violent intimidation.
Yes, the one thing in common there between the hate preachers and the people who rioted was the geography, I'm afraid. The Syrian church comes from the same troubled part of the world. The hate preachers, look, something's got to be done there. Cameron, one question with the stabbing is what the head of the Department of Climate Change had to say about it at this moment of crisis. Now, I ask that because last month the Albanese government dumped the head of our two top spy agencies, ASIO and ACIS, as permanent members of the government's National Security Committee and replaced them with the Climate Change Department boss, of all people. So how important would his advice have been when the committee met urgently on Monday night to discuss the stabbing?
Well, I mean, surely global warming and carbon credits and stuff like that would have been on the national security agenda with that guy being in the room. I'm worried that Mike Burgess has been set aside. I mean, he warned us in February that the greatest domestic threat in Australia was Islamic extremism. He said that exactly, and he was then set aside on the National Security Committee. That's my worry. My worry is that frank advice is not being taken by this government, and they'd rather listen to a climate change expert than a security expert.
I know, it goes all back to that hoax that our greatest challenge is climate change, not in fact the wars and the national security threats and the terrorism that really are on top of people's minds. Cameron Milner, Michael Costa, thank you very much to you both. After the break, Lisa Wilkinson and the ABC claim victory in the Bruce Lehrmann case. The truth, as I will show you in startling graphic little grabs, is that they've been exposed by the judge telling fake stories about a little cover-up. Plus, of course, another government embarrassment. The immigration numbers just set an unbelievable record. Shameless, shameless. I can't believe the spin from Channel 10's Lisa Wilkinson and the ABC's Paul Barry about the verdict on Monday in the Bruce Lehrmann case.
Today, the federal court has found that I published a true story.
It's an extraordinary victory for TENS, the project.
This is complete nonsense. Wilkinson, who's a host of Channel 10's The Project, and the ABC are covering up a media scandal here. An anti-liberal scandal that's been totally exposed by the judge. Bruce Lehrmann had sued Channel 10 and Wilkinson for identifying him as the man accused of raping former Liberal staffer Britney Higgins in Parliament House. But Lehrmann's plan exploded in his face when the judge on Monday said, well, actually, sorry, Bruce, you did rape Higgins, you cad, you rapist. So that much, yes, is a victory for Wilkinson. But as the judge also pointed out, Wilkinson's report on this case actually focused most on Higgins' bogus claim of a cover-up. How the then Morrison Liberal government allegedly tried to stop her telling the police she was raped, bullying her. And that is exactly how Wilkinson sold her report.
Tonight, claims of rape, roadblocks to a police investigation, and a young woman forced to choose between her career and the pursuit of justice.
And the ABC's Four Corners did a program which made the same pitch, a Liberal cover-up.
Tonight on Four Corners, we investigate how her story was kept secret for almost 2 years and why she feels her cries for help were stifled by the Canberra machine and expectations of party loyalty.
And as you know, Labor also went hard on the cover-up, smashing the Liberals. But as the judge said, this part of the story was all nonsense. In fact, Higgins' two ministerial bosses, Michaelia Cash, Linda Reynolds, had tried to make Higgins go to the police when she didn't actually want to. A sympathetic chief of staff, Reynolds' chief of staff, stepped in and defended her right to choose.
Despite Ms Brown facing sustained pressure from her minister and one of the minister's colleagues to report the incident to the AFP, even though she was then unsure an allegation was being made of rape, and irrespective of the wishes of Ms Higgins, she pushed back.
Some cover-up, as the judge said, you know, you have to come across many cover-ups where the two ministers actually almost insisting Higgins go to the police. Yet this whole conspiracy theory, pushed by Wilkinson, pushed by the ABC and by Labor, the whole Let's Get Scott Morrison campaign was based on falsehoods. Here's the judge again.
The cover-up allegation was objectively short on facts, but long on speculation and internal inconsistencies.
Joining me is Sophie Ellsworth, media writer for the Australian newspaper. Sophie, great to see you again. Look, how could Wilkinson and Barry treat that verdict as total vindication? That strikes me as the cover-up. They're covering up what the judge actually found about their pet theory.
Well, Andrew, if you simplify it, Channel 10 and Wilkinson, yes, they won this defamation case. But this is a 300-odd page report that is really quite scathing of some of the conduct of both Lisa Wilkinson and Channel 10 when they were in the works of this interview with Britney Higgins and in the presenting it on air as well. So this is not all a glowing report by any stretch. And Justice Lee did say in his remarks that Lisa Wilkinson lacked candour. He questioned her, some of her journalistic credibility in terms of her giving that infamous Logie speech, even though she was advised by the 10 lawyer Tasha Smithies that it was fine to do so. He said she was a very experienced journalist and she should have realised it was fraught with danger. So to stand out the front of court, not take any questions on this and declare victory, I think there's many in the media who can see that there is far more to this, Andrew.
Yes, when you think of how it became a political scandal, it was all about the Scott Morrison government allegedly being so anti-women, they covered up this complaint and treated her poorly and drove her out. None of it was true. None of it was true. Now, I'm sure that the judge was not impressed by claims that he actually vindicated Channel 10's reporting, judging by a story that you filed for The Australian this afternoon.
Well, that's right, Andrew. He's come out this afternoon, a story I've reported. Justice Lee has written to 10's lawyers and asked for a transcript of 10's lawyer, Justin Quill, that he gave outside court directly after, or very soon after, he handed down his judgment. And Justin had some criticisms of the legal system. And he also said that he would like a copy of the article that Justin Quill wrote in the Herald Sun and the Daily Telegraph. Now, this is not to say that Justin Quill has done anything wrong. He's just asking for transcripts at this point. But it seems that he wants to follow up on this because he perhaps is not so pleased with some of those comments that Justin Quill made outside court. But let's just see how this plays out, Andrew.
Yes, where he was vindicating Channel 10's reporting. Now, Justin's actually an excellent media lawyer. I should declare friendship with him. he's been great. But that said, it's interesting the judge's frame of mind. There's something else here, Sophie, the cover-up theory. That was one of the main reasons why the Albanese government, I think, paid Higgins $2.4 million of compensation for supposedly being treated so badly by the Liberals when she allegedly told them she'd been raped, none of which the judge believed. I think he counted 9 things she said in that claim that were not true. So the pressure now is on the government, really, to get that money back from her, isn't it?
Well, Andrew, this whole affair is far from over. If there's one woman who is vindicated in this, many are saying it is Linda Reynolds' Chief of Staff, Fiona Brown. She came out and gave evidence, in this court hearing, and Justice Lee spoke very highly of her. So this whole saga, Andrew, it just keeps on going and going. But as we know, there's another case there where she's taking legal action. So this is far from over.
It sure is. Sophie Ellsworth, thank you so much for your time. Unbelievable. After the break, we're told that the Muslim boy who had allegedly stabbed the Christian bishop, he had his mind poisoned by social media. So why is the Albanese government and the New South Wales Police not crack down on hate preachers that we've exposed right here on this show? Now, we're now told that the boy who allegedly stabbed the Christian bishop on Monday had his mind poisoned by someone on social media. His father's distraught. He says it wasn't us, so we didn't know. Maybe someone suggested the target to him. And you'd think, why would some 16-year-old decide, allegedly, that of all the people in Sydney to stab, it should be an Assyrian Christian bishop who actually hasn't been that abusive of Islam either? But if social media is the danger here, hate preachers on social media, why is the Albanese government, why have the New South Wales Police done nothing about Sydney hate preachers like this imam who exposed before, but sounds even worse in this present context?
If you attack Allah, if you attack our Prophet, our religion, and our fellow brothers and sisters, and if you attack our land, then you are going to be met with men who love death more than you love life.
Well, join me is Rowan Dean, editor of The Spectator Australia and host of Outsiders here on Sky News every Sunday at 9 a.m. Rowan, great to see you. Look, the Prime Minister has said we should come together and sure, let's not, raise the temperature. I've got that. But I also think let's not also ignore a problem that, might not be a factor in this case, we're yet to know, but something like that, all the other hate preachers we've shown here, that's clearly playing with fire.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that Anthony Albanese urges the country to come together, and while he's doing so, he's standing in front of 3 very separate and distinct flags, all of which represent Labor's different ideas of what being Australian means. So the message that Labor send out, that let's all come together, is not a message that they actually live by. They spend most of their time involved in identity politics, which divides the nation and divides people. We saw it during The Voice. We see it all the time. The reality is, Andrew, that Australia is heading directly down the same path that many European countries have gone down, and that is to have large-scale immigration without assimilation. Under Gough Whitlam, assimilation became a dirty word that the left sneer at, and the Liberals never did much to kind of change that point of view. But if you import large numbers of people from different cultures around the world, and you do not insist on assimilation, both through education, through where people live, through law enforcement, and so on, if you don't enforce assimilation, you get tribalism. And what we saw on October 9th, shamefully, was tribalism out in Greenacre and other Western Sydney suburbs, flares being let off, cheering crowds, a preacher yelling out about this is a glorious day, or whatever he said at the time. He was in ecstasy because of the vile murder, rape, beheadings of people in Israel.
Now, this sort of hatred cannot be tolerated. We need a zero tolerance approach whereby those individuals from October 9th there should have been arrests, there should have been deportations, all of which I urged on your show and on Outsiders at the time, and other people did as well. But we've seen, I think, virtually nothing since then. And so it's no wonder if our society, our government is not prepared to stand up against and refuse to tolerate this sort of religious separatism, then we all are the worse off for it, Andrew.
Absolutely. I actually think there's a double whammy here. I mean, you put your finger on one of it, of course, the preaching of division, the tribal politics, the identity politics, the government, multiculturalism, that kind of thing. But the other aspect of it is the preaching of disdain and contempt for our past. So how can you expect people from other countries to come here and love Australia if we tell them not to? Of course, they're going to retain a greater love for where they've come from and that culture. And I'll give you an example, Rowan. Sarah Sala is a human rights lawyer. She's a poet. She's an anti-Israel activist. She's worked with the Australian Human Rights Commission. And I wonder if that's actually appropriate, given, and listen to this, her hatred of Australia. Here she is.
So I was just at the City Action for Palestine, and as I was leaving, a fragile white man went up to the cops, marked behavior, and basically said to them, well, they might as well say that they hate Australia in feigned outrage. And then he gave me a look, and I was like, mate, you are not wrong. We actually do hate Australia. We're literally saying it to you. We hate the settler colonial project of Australia and the way that it treats First Nations people, the way that it is built on stolen land, in a very similar sense to the way that Israel is built on stolen land and the expulsion and theft and death of Palestinians. So if you are not getting the message that we hate Australia, settler colonial project, the colony, then we're obviously not doing our jobs very well. I hope that clears it up for you.
Born in Egypt, I wonder why she stays here, but I mean, there's so much to unpack in that. Every little touchstone of modern identity politics and the Hate Australia thing is covered there.
Well, for years, you've accurately pointed out, and I've pointed out, and others have pointed out, that the humorous side of this sort of identity politics, of this kind of undergraduate mentality that sneers at the achievements of the West and of Australia in particular. But now we are seeing, and look, Sarah Sala, I don't know anything about her. I wish her all the best, but she is just one of many examples. We talk about hate preachers. I often think that the real hate preachers are in our universities, and they're preaching hatred of this country. They're preaching hatred of Western values. They're preaching hatred of capitalism. They're clearly preaching hatred of Israel, and they're preaching racism in anti-white racism. And our kids are being brought up, supposedly smart, intelligent children are being marinated in this toxic Marxist garbage, and we have done nothing to stop it. And it's very, very simple, Andrew. We should be defunding the universities that preach this sort of garbage to our kids, because we are destroying an entire generation of supposedly intellectual, smart, bright young kids who should have a wonderful future in the best country in the world. They should be so proud to be Australian. They should be so looking forward to the opportunities that this country has given them and will give them. And yet they are mired in, I call it child abuse, student abuse, whatever you want to call it. They have had their brains poisoned by this stuff, and it is an absolute disgrace, and our governments have to step in and stop.
Rowan, I'd say something else. It's not just child abuse. I think it's national suicide as well, to be honest. I mean, how can you maintain a country if you teach people to hate it? I don't get that. Rowan Dean, thank you so much for your time. Actually, one final example I'll give you of this sort of stuff. I mean, it's just deadly. Victoria's got a version of The Voice that we said no to last year. 60% of us said no. But this version of The Voice, the First People's Assembly, is now demanding reparations. This co-chair says no amount of money, and I don't want to tally it up either, can compensate for the pain and suffering that our people have felt. But that will be a discussion for negotiations. It means with the Victorian government, which said, yes, we will discuss all this. And I just wonder what you can get for compensation as someone like that for the alleged suffering of other Aborigines, most of them long dead, and why you should get it from taxpayers like you watching who didn't cause that suffering. How does that work? I don't get it. Well, last financial year, the government let in a record number of immigrants, more than 500,000. Our cities couldn't cope, house prices went through the roof. The Albanese government said, whoops, we're going to cut immigration now by half. Instead, we find more than 100,000 immigrants net have come to Australia in February alone. 100,000 in 1 month. That's 20% more than the last record set. Joining me is the Coalition's immigration spokesman, Dan Tehan. Dan Tehan, thank you for your time. What is going on here? We were promised fewer immigrants, half the number. We instead get a new record, just unbelievably big numbers last month.
It is. For the latest ABS data shows for the month of February, permanent and semi-permanent arrivals hit 100,000 for the month of February. Now, we've never had that occur in our history. And what we're seeing under this Labor government is numbers coming into this country, the like of which we have never seen. As a matter of fact, we think the Labor Party are on target for their first term of government to bring in well over 1 million people. Now, that's when we have a housing crisis, a rental crisis, our hospitals are not being able to deal with the pressures they're under. Congestion is obviously getting worse and worse, and Labor just seems completely both hopeless and hapless when it comes to immigration.
But Dan, if you ask Australians, do you want 1 million people in 3 years to arrive here, or whatever the figure's going to be, people would say, are you crazy? Australians don't like mass immigration, not at these numbers. What do you think our intake should be?
Well, just to go to the first point, Andrew, you're absolutely right. There was nothing that was said by the Albanese Labor government before the last election that they would bring over 1 million people in their first term of government. They said nothing of the like, yet that's what they've gone and do. And everyone that I speak to says to me that when you've got a housing and a rental crisis, the pressures on services, especially on our hospitals, on congestion, that this is the last thing we need at the moment. Now, we'll be announcing our policy in the coming months. We've obviously got a very strong sense now as to what Labor's up to with their Big Australia approach to immigration. We don't think a Big Australia approach is the right way to go, and we will be very upfront now. I've got to take my policies to my colleagues in the shadow cabinet, but we will announce a policy in the coming months. But I can guarantee your listeners that we will be not pursuing the Big Australia approach that the Albanese Labor government is. We believe in lower immigration, not Labor's Big Australia approach.
What's driving, or you're not going to give me a number here, but what's driving your approach to ditching the Big Australia thing, which in fact was embraced by the Liberals for quite a while, I thought, mistakenly? Is it lack of cohesion, lack of housing? Is it, needing to unchoke our cities? What is it?
Well, it's really all of the above. We've got to make sure, in particular, that we can house people that we bring into this nation. So we've got to make sure that it's coordinated with housing. We've got to make sure that it's coordinated with what's happening with rents. We've got to make sure it's coordinated with what's happening, especially to young Australians being able to get access to the employment market. We've seen youth unemployment start to tick up for the first time, and there's some correlation with the amount of international students coming in. We've got to make sure that our health system can cope with the numbers coming in. We've got to make sure that congestion in our cities, I mean, we've seen this Albanese Labor government cut funding for infrastructure in our cities. At the same time, they're bringing in these record numbers. So we've got to calibrate all of that, and we've got to make sure that that social licence is there. And that means ensuring that we do have that social harmony that we've always treasured so much here in Australia. So all those things we have to take into account, and they'll be all considerations that we'll be making sure that we're taking account of when we put our policy in place.
Look forward to it. Meanwhile, the High Court has today started to hear an appeal which could force the Albanese government to release another 200 foreigners in detention. This time, people who refuse to go back to where they came from, they could if they go back if they wanted to. They say no, and can't be made to go back unless they do agree. The test case is an Iranian man who first claimed to be Christian, couldn't go home. That was false. Now he claims he's bisexual. It seems to me this guy's having us on. What do you think should be done to people like him that won't go back? Indefinite detention? What have you got in mind?
Well, to start with, I obviously can't comment on the case before the High Court at the moment, but our strong hope is that the government will win this. And we obviously hope that the government is putting forward all the arguments that are needed to win this case, but because it's incredibly important that we can detain these people and continually detain them if they're not cooperating with authorities, so that they can be sent back either to the country they came from or to a third country. So we're hopeful that the government will win this. They chose this case to test it in the High Court, so everything points to the fact that they should win it. Obviously, we've seen what's happened with the previous High Court case, which, due to the incompetence of the government, saw what we now know is about 152 detainees released into the community, 7 murderers, 37 sex offenders amongst them. The government has rushed through plans then to put in place ankle bracelets on those detainees. We now know that we think that at least half of them don't have those ankle bracelets. They won't tell us how many of the murderers or the sex offenders have ankle bracelets or not. So let's hope that they win this one.
Dan Tehan, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Andrew.
After the break, the left is becoming the fascist they claim to hate. I'll give you an amazing example. A socialist left mayor actually sending the police to shut down a conference of these terrible right-wing people he didn't like, with speakers including former Brexit leader Nigel Farage and former British Home Secretary Suella Braverman and more. As I said, the left is becoming the fascist they claim to hate. Take in Brussels. The socialist left mayor there has actually sent the police to shut down a conference of right-wing people, including former Brexit leader Nigel Farage, former British Home Secretary Suella Braverman, Hungary's Prime Minister. I think there's a bishop in there even. I mean, unbelievable. And the reason this guy gave, public safety. Like whose? Although this mayor also said, well, he ended it by saying, oh, the right are not welcome in the city. Here's Nigel Farage.
That meeting, over the next 2 days, you've got the Prime Minister of Hungary, you've got a bishop, you've got members of the European royal families coming, leaders of parties that will win European elections in countries this year, in June, and yet, because they're questioning ever closer union, because they're questioning globalism, they're literally being shut down. This is like the old Soviet Union. No alternative view allowed.
Joining me from London is Patrick Christie's, like Nigel Farage, a host at GB News. Patrick, this is just astonishing.
Yeah, I mean, democracy is dead in Western Europe, isn't it? The boys in blue were sent in by a raging red, and it was like something out of the Soviet Union. For anyone who had any doubts, I think, about leaving the European Union, that should have proven, I think, that we were right to leave. They did try, as you mentioned there, the oldest trick in the book of saying, we are doing this for your safety. We're doing this for public safety. But it wasn't really about that. You know, it was about deplatforming people who wanted to put things like national interests above the supranational, controlling immigration, lowering tax, national sovereignty, personal freedoms, and they can't have that in Brussels. And one of the mayors who was involved in all of this is Mayor Philippe Close. who's previously hosted an Iranian minister who's been sanctioned in the UK for human rights abuses. So he's quite choosy, really, when it comes to the kind of people he is willing to hang around with. And the Labour Party here in Britain, they were laughing at it. Now, given that they might be about to win the next general election, that should be a concern for people in Britain, that you could have 5 years of people who laugh, essentially, about people with wrong think being cancelled.
As I often say, you know, for so many people on the left, I'm generalising, but so many on the left, it's not the principle that counts, it's the side. If it was done to them, they'd be manning the barricades, but if it's done to their enemies, that's perfectly fine. I mean, it's just terrible. But speaking of terrible, Patrick, we're reeling over here over the stabbing of a Christian bishop in his church, allegedly by a 16-year-old who said the bishop insulted his Muslim prophet. But this raises again questions about our government's gentle approach to Muslim radicals. But then before I get huffy, I should have a look at what your government's doing. I mean, what's this about letting in clerics sponsored actually by the hardline Iranian regime?
Yeah, absolutely. And just quickly, I would like to wish everybody over where you are all the best after a couple of quite devastating incidents in recent days. So sending all my love to everyone involved there. But yeah, closer to where I am now. We've been giving out visas to hardline Islamic clerics who are sponsored by, appointed by, and have to pledge allegiance to the Ayatollah of Iran. They are also set up in a base called the Islamic Centre of England, which has been allowed to register itself as a charity, have around £4.2 million in the bank. Taxpayers even paid furlough for members of staff for that charity during the lockdown. And we've allowed them to essentially become a nerve centre for the Iranian government right here in the heart of London. And the other concerning thing is I was speaking to an Iranian journalist who is based in Britain at the moment. He was threatened with kidnap in the streets of Britain in London by Iranian nationals. There's been another journalist that was an Iranian journalist who was stabbed here recently as well. The concern is that Iran has sleeper cells probably around the West, really, that are ready to rise up at a moment's notice if indeed they are given those orders. And we have been allowing it to happen. So you add that to all of the other problems that we've imported into this country, and it's not particularly good.
Look, you know, when I hear, you've had many reports like this and other woke issues as well, I'm stunned that you have got a Conservative government for years now, and this is happening under them. Heaven forfend when Labor takes over. What's been the I know you've run hard on this particular one. What's been the reaction elsewhere? Because I contrast this to the French president throwing out clerics who are tied to nasty foreign regimes in the Middle East. He's got rid of them. Your government's welcoming them.
Yeah, we're far too soft, and people have been saying this for a very, very long time. And it's heaping massive pressure on our security services. We have around 44,000 people on a terror watch list. The vast majority of them are Islamist terrorists. We allowed, at one stage in Britain's history, we allowed a higher proportion of returning ISIS fighters than Saudi Arabia. Lots of people questioning why on earth we've done this. But yeah, we seem incredibly difficult to be able to actually deport anybody, but we're still allowing some of these clerics at that Islamic Centre of England to travel to and from Tehran. I know we have interest in that region. I know that oil talks and that kind of stuff talks, but people need to come to the realisation more and more that actually some people in this country do not like us and do not want to assimilate. And I hope that the government will wake up to that at some point, although they've had 14 years, Andrew.
This is Rip Van Winkle length of napping on the job. Unbelievable. Patrick, have a great holiday. You're off. Enjoy yourself. Love to have you back, I hope next week. See you later. Thank you, Patrick Christies. That's it from me. Now it's Sherry Markson. Good night.